Good evening, everyone. I'm so happy that you could all come this evening. It's one of the first in-person events in my memory, and maybe not in yours, but it's good to be back in person to things, especially in this wonderful room inside the Graduate Center. The Graduate Center is a home to lots of academic activity in this university. It's the center of the university, and I'm proud to be an emeritus member of its faculty. If you look up, you see the Empire State Building. It's easier to see when it's in the daytime. Okay. This evening we have a discussion on a conversation on the language of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and this will be an event where we can ask questions. I would hope that this is a civil discussion. This is a conflict, of course, that is sometimes not civil, but in this room in the Graduate Center, I think we should agree that it should be a civil conversation from various points of view. You will be able to get cards to ask questions, to write them down, and I'll read them for you. But the first thing I'd like to do is to thank President Robin Garrell for being here. Robin Garrell is the president of the CUNY Graduate Center. Let me say a few words about her as an introduction. She has been here during the pandemic since 2020, and this is not an easy time to be a president of an academic institution. It's perhaps the worst of times. She came here from UCLA, and there she was a provost, and she's a fellow chemist. I'm a chemist. Maybe it doesn't sound like I am, but I am. And she came from Cornell University and then the University of Michigan. And I'm so happy that she's here to say a few words of introduction to what I think will be an interesting event. Thank you.
Thank you, Manfred. So good evening. Careful here. With our home here at 5th Avenue and 34th Street, the Graduate Center sits at a cultural crossroads. In the heart of our global city and as part of the largest urban public university in the nation, we are committed to examining issues of worldwide concern through scholarship and informed debate. We encourage our faculty and our student scholars to engage in research that advances the public good, and we are proud home of more than 30 centers and institutes that bring that research into the public forum. The Center for Jewish Studies, a co-host tonight, is one such center. We are also home to the renowned Middle East and Middle Eastern American Center and the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies, which tonight is also hosting an event featuring the new biography of Ralph Bunche, written by UCLA professor Cal Raustiala. The scholars affiliated with our centers seek to promote peace and understanding through rigorous examination and discussion of difficult topics. The Graduate Center draws students from throughout the New York metro region and from around the world to our 48 graduate programs. Our doctoral students teach more than 140,000 CUNY students each year. And we urge our students to lead by example, to consider multiple viewpoints as they debate issues in their Graduate Center classes and when they moderate discussions in their CUNY classrooms. Tonight's conversation on the language of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is especially timely, given recent political developments in Israel and the disturbing rise in anti-Semitism and bigotry here in the United States. We have seen very clearly how language used by leaders and newsmakers shapes opinion and shades understanding. Words are powerful tools for promoting peace or for fomenting hatred. Tonight's speakers will examine how the vocabulary used by scholars to frame the conflict between Israel and Palestine has changed throughout the years and the far-reaching impact of the shifts. I look forward to learning with you about the scholarship that informs their perspectives, and it is my pleasure to invite tonight's moderator, David Brodsky, the chairperson of the Department of Judaic Studies at Brooklyn College, and an associate faculty member of the Center for Jewish Studies here at the Graduate Center, to introduce his fellow scholars and to say more about the event. David.
I want to thank you all for coming to our panel discussion on word crimes, a conversation on the language of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm especially honored that President Robin Garrell of the Graduate Center and President Michelle Anderson of my college have joined us today. I also want to thank our sponsors, the CUNY Academy for the Humanities and Sciences, the History Program, and the Center for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Center, the Judaic Studies Department, We Stand Against Hate, and the Ethel Wolf Institute for the Humanities at Brooklyn College, the Hillels at Baruch, Queens, and City College, it's a lot of sponsors, right? The Association for the Study of the Middle East and Africa, and Scholars for Peace in the Middle East. The talk has been sponsored by the Anti-Semitism Education Initiative at CUNY through a generous grant from the Academic Engagement Network. On February 16th, 2016, while I was attending a faculty council meeting at Brooklyn College, a group of students stood up and made a series of demands. They asked for free tuition for students, for higher wages and health care for adjuncts, and for all Zionists out of CUNY. In August 2021, the Cross-CUNY Working Group Against Racism and Colonialism sent an email to faculty inviting us to a series of talks on Zionism in Israel. In this email, they stated from the outset that they were not open to, quote, multiple perspectives, unquote, arguing that, quote, the only two sides are complicity or resistance, unquote. It was against this backdrop that a number of professors across CUNY came together to form CAFI, the CUNY Alliance for Inclusion, which has organized this talk. CAFI's goal is to reintroduce respectful conversation back into the academy, starting with the topic of Israel and Zionism, since this has most recently taken a turn towards intolerance, but not limited to that topic. I want to add here, just as an aside, that an email from one of these opposing groups went out today, and it's actually in the handout that they gave you, excoriating us both as a group and each of us personally for holding this event. In their statement, they cherry-pick quotes from each of us to exemplify why we in this event should all be anathematized. For my part, I stand behind everything I've written, but I do not stand behind every newspaper article in which I've been quoted. I never have and never would essentialize my colleagues by calling them, quote, the anti-Semites, unquote. And I say, you're right for having taken me to task were I to have said that, right? I do not do that. And I tried to get the quote corrected when it came out that very day, to no avail. My purpose here, both today as moderator and in general, is to help bring civil discourse back into the discussion of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So with that aside, back to my introductory remarks. The question facing the U.S. Supreme Court right now in 303 Creative via Lennis is when and how may individuals or groups discriminate against others under the guise of free speech. The question this panel seeks to address is when and how did vilification of and calls to discriminate against Zionists and Israelis become integral to the academy? The claim the panel will make is that this was accomplished by co-opting the language of the discourse by defining and redefining the language applied to Israel and Zionism. The conversation will take place in three parts. In the first half hour, the panelists will each offer their remarks. In the second half hour, we will have a question and answer period between the moderator, me, and the panelists. And in the last half hour, we will open up the questions to the audience. Okay? Without further ado, let me introduce our three panelists. Donna Robinson-Devine, in the middle, is the Morningstar Family Professor of Jewish Studies and Professor of Government Emerita at Smith College, where she taught a variety of courses on Middle East politics. Able to draw on material in Hebrew, Arabic, and Turkish, no easy feat, let me tell you. Her books include Women Living Change, Cross-Cultural Perspectives, essays from the Smith College Research Project on Women and Social Change, Politics, and Society in Ottoman Palestine, Society in Ottoman Palestine, the Arab Struggle for Survival and Power, Post-Colonial Theory, and the Arab-Israeli Conflict. These aren't, it's hard for me to tell where each of the titles begins and ends, and I don't have them, they didn't come through italicized for some reason. So anyway, Exiled in the Homeland, Zionism, and the Return to Mandate Palestine. I'm sorry that I butchered some of that. I think most of the italics when it came through here didn't go through, so I apologize. Asaf Romirowsky is the Executive Director of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East and the Association for the Study of the Middle East and Africa. Romirowsky is also a Senior Non-Resident Research Fellow at the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies and a Professor Affiliate at the University of Haifa. Trained as a Middle East historian, he holds a PhD in Middle East and Mediterranean Studies from King's College London and has published widely on the Arab-Israeli conflict, American foreign policy in the Middle East, and on Israeli and Zionist history. Romirowsky is co-author of Religion, Politics, and the Origins of Palestine Refugee Relief, a contributor to The Case Against Academic Boycotts of Israel, and co-editor of Word Crimes, Reclaiming the Language of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. Romirowsky's publicly engaged scholarship has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the National Interest, the American Interest, the New Republic, the Times of Israel, Jerusalem Post, Ynet, and Tablet Magazine. And Miriam Elman, on the far end there, has served as executive director of the educational nonprofit Academic Engagement Network since 2019. From 2009 to 2022, she was an associate professor of political science at Syracuse University, where she held the title of Robert McCleary Professor of Teaching Excellence at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. An award-winning scholar and teacher, Elman has edited and co-edited 6 books and a number of special issues for academic journals, including Israel Studies. She's the author of over 70 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters on topics related to contemporary anti-Semitism, academic freedom and campus-free expression, peace and conflict resolution, religion and politics in Israel, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Elman received her BA from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and her master's and PhD from Columbia University. She has held pre- and postdoctoral fellowships at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, Harvard Kennedy School, and was a tenured member of the faculty at Arizona State University before moving to Syracuse. Elman has delivered hundreds of guest lectures in her areas of expertise and is frequently featured in media outlets in the US and Israel. In recognition of her work in 2018, the Allgemeiner newspaper listed her among the top 100 people worldwide who are positively influencing Jewish life. So we have quite an esteemed panel here. Without further ado, let me begin. Without further ado, let me begin with Donna Devine, who will be speaking on, well, she'll introduce her own.
Palestinian dispossession and oppression is not a conflict. This is about settler colonialism.
Excuse me. We're trying to have civil discourse.
No more money for Israel's crimes. Not another nickel, not another dime. No more money for Israel's crimes. The graduate president is sitting right here today, witnessing racists up here speaking over Palestinians. Do you see Palestinians present here?
What?
No. You're here. This is about settler colonialism and apartheid. You should be ashamed of yourself. CUNY stands for Palestine. I'm calling the police. Do it. This is about standing on the side of right and justice for women and Palestinian liberation. This is what the CUNY students and workers want. We will never be complicit with oppression. University stands for. The People's University is here for people. Take care of the women of Iran. Take care of the women of Iran first. Take care of the women of Iran first.
Thank you. If you stick around to the end, we'll give you a chance to ask your questions. Okay?
About a decade or so ago, a panel at the American Historical Association annual conference emphasized the alleged difficulties of gaining full access to documents preserved and classified at Israel's military and state archives relating to the strategies deployed by the country in waging the 1948 war. One panelist stated, with apparent concurrence from others, that a full and unfettered reading of such papers would likely show how Yishuv leaders planned and ordered military forces to expel Palestinians, thereby imprinting on the blameless a narrative of shame for not having stood their ground. to uncover the real evidence of what directions were given to the Army during the fateful year of 1948 is, according to this view, not only to repudiate the idea of a national Palestinian failure, it is also to restore to these innocents their full political rights, presumably even carrying them back to the towns and villages they or their ancestors once called home. It's a shame they left, isn't it? I came of age at a time when no idea was too sacred to avoid interrogation. And so it seemed reasonable to me to use the upcoming Association for Israel Studies conference as an opportunity to organize a discussion on Israeli archives with particular focus on 1948. I contacted Dr. Yaakov Lozowick, then Israel's state archivist, who was not only happy to join such a discussion, he was also enthusiastic to expand it to include Dr. Ilana Alon, then head of the military archives. After securing their agreement, I turned back to the very people who had leveled the charges against Israel at the conference to ask them to become part of this inquiry. All of them turned down my invitation, citing their commitments to boycott Israeli academic institutions. Let me be clear. The very people who accuse Israel of prohibiting critics from securing information, presumably vital for one of the most cherished principles of the Palestinian cause, sustain their claims against the Jewish state by refusing to enter the country, even to gather the evidence they say would convert such charges into a genuine indictment. Better to raise the charges that fit a narrative than to try to uncover the facts to corroborate them. That convinced me that the narrative itself had to be investigated. And so I turned to my great friends, brilliant friends, Asaf and Miriam, to ask if they would be willing to explore the discourse in what became the special issue of Israel Studies, the premier journal in the field, which was published in April 2019. The volume examines the linkage between language and thought, long a staple of philosophical inquiry, and asks whether deploying terms like genocide or apartheid offers a genuine understanding of the complexities of the conflict. It calls attention to how certain words and ideas have begun to settle into daily use, and to measure the consequences for the academic study of Israel, of Palestinians, of the conflict, and not incidentally of the nature of politics. The politics propagated by what has become the accepted discourse is binary, fit into good or bad rubrics that appeal to feelings, not into categories that can actually show how power is wielded. Identifying the words that have become central in this discourse, the volume shows how a lexical transformation has acquired a kind of totemic standing in the academy, spreading beyond campus perimeters to gain momentum in an increasingly networked world. The volume focuses on terms because they function much like oracles, coaxing judgments in the absence of evidence, so long as Israel is assigned to a rhetorical zone once reserved for brutal regimes committing ghastly crimes. Our project to subject the conventional way of talking and writing about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to sustained analysis, and to do so by examining its linguistic parts, was intended to open up not closed down discussions. As much as the essays in the collection are about words, they are also about history and politics. The first section focuses on terms: indigeneity, colonialism, occupation, terrorism, and apartheid, that claim to disclose new aspects of the conflict's history and of the mechanisms deployed to perpetuate it. It is worth noting that utilizing these terms as historical paradigms has generated no new data or information that could be the basis for a new or deeper understanding of the conflict. As many of us, as academicians, were often drawn to cutting-edge, new ways of asking questions. We did this with women, we do this with class, we do this in any number of instances, but you have to examine what the questions yield, what information the questions yield. Israel and Zionism is cast as a form of imperialism, and so the vocabulary has been converted. A vocabulary that's supposed to be used for historical explanation has been converted into a kind of crude moral idiom. I could give no better explanation than the people who started off up here. The special issues second section focuses on terms co-opted from the modern Jewish experience: Holocaust, refugee, human rights, Zionism, to show how they have been projected onto the experience of Palestinians, to transfer the imaginative narrative of one beleaguered people to another. Finally, the volume evaluates concepts that are decidedly postmodern inventions: Islamophobia, intersectionality, pinkwashing. These trendy terms aim to rally allies around a new logic of ethical reasoning and political action. The last essay in the volume addresses the contorted reasoning required to apply the pivotal concept civil society, taken for granted in political theory and as evidence in the late 20th century, taken for granted as expanding democracies. This has been applied to NGOs whose actions are not simply funded, but also programmed by foreign governments, and whose ties to movements thriving on acts of terror are well known and well documented. Such linkages are more likely to deny than preserve the autonomy believed central to civil society and to democracy, diminishing, not expanding, a spirit of active political engagement among Palestinians. The academic jargon, now so fully draped in scholarly prestige, implies that Israel's founding in 1948 is not settled history. The intention is not simply to raise ethical questions, but also to suggest the possibility of righting what is taken for granted as an historical wrong. Those who subscribe to the approach are not talking about historical facts that continue to weigh heavily on present circumstances, which is to say the persistence of Israel's unresolved conflicts with Palestinians, problems that affect the Jewish state's politics and complicate the operations of its democracy. The implication that shadows this discourse is that history can be reversed, registering a kind of magical thinking more fit for novels than for classrooms. Almost 75 years since its founding, and more than half a century since the war that reconfigured the Jewish state, and not incidentally the entire Middle East, raising the same questions over and over again, posed during the first decades of the 20th century, generates a chasm between language and reality. And of course, driving this change is the emergence of the new media. There is a difference between a language operating as an echo chamber, advocating a mission, and one that stresses for exactitude and for a reliable assessment of a complex situation. Let me offer two examples in more detail. Settler colonialism. Marking an enterprise colonial imposes a predictable set of expectations on the development of a country. Even when the colonial system seemed all-powerful, it never bent all the oppressed to its will. And its material dislocations opened opportunities for those subordinate to chart their own path to independence. Ironically, the colonialism paradigm exposes the myriad failures of Palestinians to plant their national flag in any land they can claim to have liberated. To blunt the imprint of shame sometimes rained down on Palestinians for not having stood their ground, not only did the magnitude of Zionist crimes have to be ramped up, but colonialism's crimes also had to be amplified into something called settler colonialism, which is a process by which colonial settlers were determined to exterminate a population whose own national aims presumably stood in the way of founding a Jewish state. But in fact, Zionist settlements in Ottoman and British Mandate Palestine bore no relation to the pattern of cruelty and land grabs common to the so-called settler colonialization of America and Australia. It was 19th century Ottoman reforms that introduced, albeit slowly, the possibility of private ownership of agricultural lands. The Ottoman Empire opened up its economy to international trade by giving foreigners more private property rights and privileges in the countryside. Nor was Great Britain's support for a Jewish national home in Palestine unconditional or designed to enrich Jews and impoverish Palestinians. Finally, Zionism was not predisposed to eliminating the so-called indigenous Arab population. In fact, Hebrew literature in the early years of the Zionist enterprise in Palestine is saturated with romantic notions of the Arab as overflowing with life, in contrast to this diaspora Jew, who is typically represented as withered and dying. Zionists aimed at bringing a new civilization to the diaspora Jew and not to the Arabs they encountered in Palestine. In short, because Zionism focused on transforming the Jewish people, which in the end was Mishnah impossible, but that's another story, this was a cultural program that at least initially was more than willing to make room for so-called others. The term genocide. The transfer of the word genocide from its Jewish meaning to its new Palestinian one is not an accident, but a deliberate decision by activists and scholars supportive of the Palestinian cause. Of all the catchwords hijacked by the study of the Middle East conflict, none has turned taboos inside out more than genocide. It has planted in susceptible minds powerful and misleading ideas about the purported savagery of Zionism. But to conjure up an image of the Zionist movement as Nazi-like that requires so many inversions of language that the development of a Jewish national home is condemned now not by might or power, but rather by false analogies, misplaced modifiers, and mistakenly applied theories. That the Palestinian population on the West Bank and Gaza has increased fourfold since 1948 should elicit an instant correction, if not an apology for such rhetorical excess. But lack of a single shred of evidence that can corroborate an alleged Zionist genocidal impulse has done nothing to even short-circuit its deployment. At least one well-known scholar of genocide, who used to be the editor of the Journal of Genocide, recently labeled and recently dismissed the classic definition as a concept invented to legitimize the founding of a Jewish state. The credibility of the term, he insists, should rest not on the violence unleashed to exterminate a people, but on its capacity to account for Israel's mistreatment of Palestinians. Rather than defined as the mass murder of an ethnic or religious population, genocide, according to him, is now purportedly a force depriving a people of independent political agency. In 1979, Edward Said posed what he called the question of Palestine, criticizing liberals and progressives in the US and Europe for supporting Israel's establishment and for presumably ignoring the chaos, bereavement, and displacement meted out in the course of founding a Jewish state. Said's work helped transform public discourse on Israel, but it also touched off another persistent query. Why have worldwide attention and significant global backing not brought Palestinians closer to fulfilling their presumed national ambitions? Perhaps because when the question of Palestine was transcribed into an international cause, it compromised the notion that Palestinians themselves have the capacity to forge their own political future. What makes the Palestinian narrative resonate in the academy comes through a distillation of history that ignores facts and avoids logic. Its deepest problem is that it deprives Palestinians themselves of access to their actual history and to the real options available to them for advancing their political interests. The question never raised or fully addressed is whether a total opposition to Zionism became a self-fulfilling strategy for failure. Would sharing the land, when Zionists accepted much more equitable proposals for dividing the territory, as in 1937 or 1947 or even 1949, represent a road not taken and one that would have given Palestinians a base for their own nation state? Engendering a fatalism about politics as the art of the possible, while making a totem of the impossible, may satisfy the conceit of leaders, but does nothing to improve the lives of ordinary people. State formation is the issue Palestinians have long tried to hide or elide or blur, but cannot ignore or bypass forever. For Palestinians are caught in the crossfire of conflicting imperatives, and none is more discordant from the need to build state institutions than the passion to remain a cause. Meeting material needs requires laws and institutions to promote economic development in a land with recognized borders. Fulfilling the promises of their national narrative suggests continuing the struggle for liberation, if not for redemption from a history blighted by displacement and dishonor. Resources mobilized for one are unavailable for the other. Building a state, given current circumstances, demands compromise and forging an agreement with Israel. Embracing a cause promising to erase past defeats and restoring people to the lands lost in several wars is, at least given the present balance of forces, an unreachable goal. For that reason, Palestinians are destined to pay a higher price for the perpetuation of the conflict than Israelis. The former, that is, the Palestinians, denied political agency by their own leaders, much more so than by Israel or by its occupation. Those of us writing about Israel and the Middle East conflict are something of expert witnesses on how radically and thoroughly a hegemonic lexicon can degrade scholarship. Starting with a presumption of complexity challenges the misleading and misnamed intersectional rubric, where diverse histories and cultures are force-fed into a binary narrative dividing the globe into oppressor-oppressed. The vocabulary coming from this binary view of the academic study of Israel and of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has resulted in placing emphasis on purported feelings over hard evidence. Charges are pigeonholed into moral absolutes that appeal to emotions or to a larger ideological agenda. To say that this is unhelpful for understanding the Middle East conflict is an understatement. To consider this an adequate approach to the study of politics is delusional.
Thank you very much. Asaf, do you want to? I don't have the titles of the talks, but if you could just.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming tonight. Obviously, I want to thank my friends and colleagues, Miriam and Donna. When we started this project 3 years ago, I don't think any of us thought that we were going to be still talking about this project for so long. But this has been as Donna mentioned, the idea was, this entire impetus was to interrogate terms that we believed hijacked the totality of the Arab-Israeli conflict, in particular in the academy. And one of the ultimate goals that we had when we conceived this idea was to give many of our academic colleagues, and many of us deal, in our day jobs with scholarship and in the academy at large, was to provide absolute data and scholarly work that could be used in classroom and syllabi and whatnot. And that was the intent of publishing this book, the journal, as an academic journal. Actually, at the beginning, early on, we were trying to explore other publications, but we thought it would meet our goals at large. It's also important, by way of background, to understand that before the publication came to fruition, all of us presented the concept at academic conferences amongst our own disciplines. And we presented this on both coasts. We were in California, we were also in Washington, and in the room, in the audience, were scholars left, right, and center. And actually, it was fascinating to see, and we were also encouraged by the concept itself, that after we spoke and presented the idea, the notion of what we were trying to do, people came to us and said, let us join the project. So, I mean, the feeling about how this project would come about was very positive. We were doing a service to the academy, and in particular to the area of which many of us come out of as far as Middle East studies and Israel studies. This was the concept that we were hoping to achieve. What was interesting about it, and obviously the reactions to the entire experiment itself as we look at it today, was we were attacked. The marginalization, because we were willing to take on the orthodoxy of the day. We tackled terms that were, if you look at the language of those who are advocates of the boycott movement, have used this kind of terminology to actually shut down debate rather than to actually open up debate. And really speaks to my mind, and in my day job, what I see around the country and around the world, a degradation of the academy, refusing to actually have debates. The reactions to the publication itself, after it was published, we were looking to go and present at panels within Israel studies in the United States and in Europe, where people were shutting us down from actually having conversations, if that's actually any quite telling about the limit or their ability to discuss in an academic, coherent way topics that are important to discuss. And so this was the reaction to the this vocabulary that we decided to tackle at large. And so that's also a point of worthy of note. That you will note that the title of the publication was Word Crimes. Those who opposed the title itself considered themselves to be war criminals, and so everybody was going around with this tagline as being a war criminal and that we should not be allowed to talk about these issues. We were attacked by being weak scholars. We were considered to be mouthpieces for the Israeli government. Anytime you could drum up any kind of notion of derogatory terms against us was all leaked to social media, and so the story went on and on. The interesting part about the story itself, and I think that that's also important for everybody to understand, is that the individuals that were chosen to author the pieces that we selected and the terms, and again, this is an ongoing project. We only selected a few terms that we believed that were essential and were part of the low-hanging fruit when it comes to the Arab-Israeli conflict, and there's a lot more to discuss and dissect as a result of the reactions themselves, were people on both political aisles, left, right, and center. We chose them because of their political expertise, their academic bona fides, with the idea of finding terms that they have looked at and dissected, with the idea of the entire project interrogating proper terms that would give them the proper academic usage when it comes to looking at the terminology of the Arab-Israeli conflict. But the Arab-Israeli conflict itself has been used, a lot of these terms has been used as ammunition to boycott and squash debate rather than actually have debate. And so it's been destructive, and a lot of these areas, within the larger terminology itself, and I come out of Middle East Studies, you find this within a discipline of the Association of Middle East Studies in America today. You find it within other disciplines. Many of the academic associations who've decided to boycott the state of Israel are using these kind of terminology, and with the idea of shutting down the conversation and not having down debate because of how loaded these terms are, or how unwilling they are to dissect and actually look at the terminology and look at what they mean. Refusing to debate and discourse, that, to my mind, goes against what the goal of the academy should be about, and goes against what the intention of discourse and research, which should be taking place in general on all of these topics, but they are not. So it's quite depressing to find that many of our colleagues were refusing to actually talk about these issues and to actually look at the meaning and what we were trying to achieve by looking at terms that are real terms. Case in point, and one of the terms that I have spent and looked at for the past 20 years has to do with the anomaly of the Arab-Palestinian refugees. Arab-Palestinian refugees are an anomaly within refugee populations at large. Arab-Palestinian refugees are the only growing population that you see, in the tone of the millions, and they are the only refugee population at large that has defined and redefined its own existence. Uniquely defined, Arab-Palestinian refugees are individuals who define themselves according to the UN Workers' Relief Agency, UNRWA, the UN agency devoted to the sustainability and to the maintenance of Arab-Palestinian refugees, who are defined, and I paraphrase here, anybody who was in mandatory Palestine in square brackets between 1946 and 1948, and the kicker is, and their next of kin. So, it's the only population of refugee populations that can inherit refugee status. So when you look at the understanding of how, when you talk today, how many Arab-Palestinian refugees exist to this day, they're in the millions because you can inherit refugee status. So, case in point, usually Muslim hereditary is patriarchal. In the course of the 60s and 70s, there was an expansion of to make it more matriarchal and patriarchal as well, thus doubling the numbers as far as who was an Arab-Palestinian refugee, allowing for mother and father lineage to increase the numbers. There has been resurrection of the dead, the double counting of numbers, all demanding one of the more key phrases that again ties into what I would consider one of the key ingredients of these demands is the fallacious so-called right of return. The right of return to what is not the Palestinian state to be, but rather to the instead of the modern state of Israel. Actually, I would argue that Arab-Palestinian nationalism and Arab-Palestinian identity at large is basically synonymous to three issues. And that has to do with the right of return, that has to do with the fact that it is permanent and sacrosanct, and the struggle against Israel is permanent, and the recognition of refugee status at large is to convince the international community of a demand of the community must sustain the refugees through UNRWA and the ongoing sustainability of aid to the Arab-Palestinian refugees. As a sidebar note, it's also important to understand that the United States to date is still the largest Western contributor to UNRWA, which is that same agency, and the tone of about close to a third of UNRWA's annual budget up until the Trump administration came to office, which amounted to about $400 million annually of U.S. taxpayer dollars that goes to sustain and maintain this project. Since UNRWA was created back in 1949, I would argue that the United States to date has paid between $72.1 to about $74.5 billion in U.S. taxpayer dollars going to sustain and maintain a project that has no end. Part of the issue when it comes to the refugee issue, and if you look at refugees worldwide, there have been, since World War II, millions of refugees who've all sustained who've been dispossessed from their lands and whatnot. The interesting part is the only one that continues to maintain and sustain itself are the Arab Palestinians. It's interesting at large that usually the sister organization to the UNRWA is a group called UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, because they understand a refugee, that we all come from our own refugee story. We have our story of where we came from and where we're going, given changes of maps and architecture and geographical and cultural changes. Refugee is only for one generation, usually. UNRWA is the only one where you can maintain and sustain a refugee status for generations and generations to come, which is exactly why even individuals who have no idea about places in their status know to tell the permanent sacrosanct understanding of the Arab refugee problem, and they continue to demand this right of return. And that, to my mind, has, in many ways, encompassed the totality of the Arab-Israeli conflict. I would argue that actually, out of the entire history of the peace process at large, that has been focused over the years on three issues: shared capital when it comes to Jerusalem, the question of the disputed lands when it comes to 67, and the right of return. The one issue that continues to maintain the conflict from generation to generation is the right of return. If this was solely a territorial conflict, we would have seen a resolution for this issue years ago, but because Palestinian identity is rooted in the perception, I would say fallacious perception, of Palestinian refuginess and statelessness, this is what continues to maintain the ongoing conflict. If there was, and let me be clear here, the argument, to my mind, is not about forgetting or a collective memory of their past, but it's about moving from refugee status to statehood, to citizenship. This is really at the juncture of the movement or the lack of willingness to to move on to a Palestinian state where you become a citizen, and this is maintained in this understanding, and to Donna's point, what she was saying before about the victimology mentality, that by being able to maintain refugee status and victimhood in perpetuity, that maintains the stasis and actually prevents the Palestinian state to be, if it were ever to come about, from actually happening, which is why every negotiation between Israelis and Palestinians, there has been, even though an agreement to discussion about percentages of right of return, compensation for the right of return, there's been a flat-out rejection by the Palestinian Authority to accept the right of return, because if it's not going to be total and encompassing, they don't see that as happening. And by the way, every Arab-Palestinian leader from Arafat going forward has used and abused this terminology as a catchphrase to prevent these kind of conversations. Actually, you've also seen examples over the years from individuals like bin Laden and others who've all used the Palestinian cause to promote their own narrative, but none of them, and by the way, it's also critical to understand, no Arab country with the exception of Jordan, has ever offered the Arab-Palestinian citizenship by design, with the idea of blaming the totality of the existence, or the so-called existence of the refugees, on the state of Israel. And let me be also clear here. Israel in the 1950s already agreed to take in percentages of the refugees, and they were flatly denied, because part of the discussion about these issues was about accepting Israel's right to exist in peace, and when it was pivoted one in front of the other, if it was going to be peace and accepting the refugees, of course, one did not go hand in hand, and they were shut down. So again, this is one of the critical issues to my mind of looking at this issue at large. It's interesting to also note, historically speaking, something that I've looked at over the years. One of the first groups to actually take responsibility for about 18 months of the Arab-Palestinian refugees were the Quakers. And the Quakers had involvement, had responsibility for Gaza for about 18 months. The Quakers, historically speaking, took on, this was their largest refugee project they've ever taken on, and nothing since. Interestingly enough, to their credit, they identified many of the problems that we identified later on when it comes to UNRWA, as it relates to the double counting, the numbers, the resurrection of the dead, and who is actually a refugee. One of the reasons that the Quakers actually left the scene in Gaza when UNRWA comes about in 1949, and they were asked to stay, was because their background was understanding, according to refugee understanding by our own American outlook on refugee issues worldwide, was about resettlement and reintegration. And because they saw UNRWA as a vehicle to maintain Arab Palestinians in a stasis rather than kind of resettlement, then that's why they left the scene, because they saw this as not having any solution for the problem, which is exactly why we see today, according to UNRWA accounts, you could go up between 6 to 7 million individuals who are all demanding a full right of return. One of the few things, historically speaking, that was actually an eye-opener on this issue, what happened during the Arab Spring in 2007, 2009, where you saw Syrian refugees fleeing for their lives, actually going to UNRWA, and then they were shut down and said no, because we can't only help one population. And of course there was, there's clearly a double standard between refugee populations when it comes to the gold standard, quote unquote, as it relates to Arab Palestinians, and individuals who were actually, fleeing for their life and being gassed, what was happening in Syria under the Assad regime. Lastly, I think it's, just to sum up, I think it's critical as far as, understanding this. I mean, as to quote, in one of his succinct essays, I think George Orwell wrote in Politics in the English Language, and I quote here, he wrote, the words democracy, socialism, freedom, patriotic, realistic justice have each of them several different meanings, which cannot be reconciled from one another. In the case of a word like democracy, not only is there no agreed definition, but the attempt to make one resist from all sides is almost universally felt, and every country can be called democratic while praising it. Consequently, defenders of every kind of regime claim it as democracy, and the fear that they might have to stop using the word it's tied down to any one meaning is something they're afraid they always refuse to do. Orwell is quite, puts the issue quite, I think, in right terms when he defines these issues about how this terminology, many of these terms have been used at large. All we were trying to do, and I think that this is, critical to all three of us here, was the attempt to open debate, not shut down debate. And I think that part of the reactionary issues here is really quite telling about what the Academy is willing to accept when you go against the grain, against the prevailing orthodoxy of the day. So I welcome all questions on these topics and look forward to the Q&A. Thank you very much.
So it's a pleasure to be here with my fellow panelists. Thank you so much, President Garrell, for introducing our event. And as this is the inaugural event of the Anti-Semitism Education Initiative, which recently launched here at CUNY, I'd like to thank the principal investigator of this important effort. So thank goes to Ilya Bratman, who as many of you know, wears two hats as director of multiple CUNY Hillels and also as a faculty member at Baruch. And of course, the members of the steering committee for this grant, longtime faculty members at CUNY, Azi Genak, Azi's back there, and Manfred Philipp, of course, Manfred. And it really is heartening to see so many CUNY co-sponsors, which underscores the critical importance of the conversation that we're having tonight. Thank you to all of you in the audience, including students and university leaders, faculty, and community members. As you've already heard, 3 years ago, my fellow panelists and I co-edited this little book. Okay, that's what we've been talking about. A special issue of the journal Israel Studies. And as my colleagues have already noted, we aim to challenge the delegitimizing, politicized language that is often used to describe Israel and its conflict with the Palestinians. And our central question was, how does the misuse and abuse of language frame the academic discourse about Israel and Zionism? How have fundamental terms and concepts like genocide, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, occupation, and colonialism been stripped of their original historical meanings and applied to Israel's conduct? Israel was once held up as a model of self-sacrifice and redemption. The Jewish population of Israel seen as an oppressed people fleeing persecution and genocide, but now morphed into agents of an aggressive and colonial settler state, a state that stands accused of the most heinous crimes and human rights abuses. How that happened in the academy can be understood, at least in part, in our view, by focusing on a misleading, deceptive, and malicious vocabulary. The volume, which we provocatively titled Word Crimes, was meant to challenge an anti-Zionist hegemonic consensus, the routinely deployed lexicon that dominates the discourse and is now so conventional that it's basically baked into many disciplines and fields of study, especially in the humanities. And we have a situation today on campuses and here at CUNY as well, where certain departments, certain academic units have in essence become hostile campus spaces for those Jewish students and dissenting faculty who form their identities around a commitment to Israel and Zionism. What the contributors to the volume suggested was that an assault on meaning was in fact a crime against language, a corruption and perversion of language. We attempted to document the abuses and how the terms selected couldn't be simply abandoned to the definitions that were being promoted by anti-Zionists. Apartheid was one example. Its important historical meaning in South Africa diminished by its inaccurate application to the Israeli state and society, certainly west of the Green Line. Human rights, indigeneity, and occupation were other terms we selected. Zionism was a term that we absolutely thought had to be included. How could the term that was meant to depict a movement for Jewish self-determination become so utterly redefined, so thoroughly discredited? And what is at stake by demonizing and delegitimizing the term Zionism? How is the abuse of this term experienced by students, by faculty, by staff who support the Jewish state and for whom Zionism is essential to their faith-based identity, as is keeping Shabbat, the Sabbath, or keeping kosher for others? It's evident that a great deal of anti-Semitism today masquerades as anti-Zionism. Sometimes hatred against Jews is expressed just by replacing the word Jews with the word Zionists, and it's often blatantly obvious. This past spring, CUNY law students, leaders of the Students for Justice in Palestine chapter, urged their peers to, quote, demand that Zionist professors are not welcome on your campus. Demand that Zionist students are not in spaces where Palestinian students are. These are calls for the purging of Jews. So we saw anti-Zionism as another important term to interrogate, and scholar Shani Moore ably takes it on in the volume. He has a chapter in here. And in his essay, he distinguishes between three types of anti-Zionism. He argues that anti-Zionism is not the same as anti-Semitism because in any form, anti-Zionism stands or falls on its own merits. The obsessional hatred of Israel in some quarters of contemporary intellectual life is easy enough to challenge without needing to prove anti-Semitic intent on the part of its practitioners, he insists. And in interrogating anti-Zionism, there's a history here that we need to remember, particularly in Jewish communal debates before Israel's statehood. Anti-Zionism first emerged among Jews, including within Orthodox circles, which viewed a Jewish national liberation movement as a form of heresy, and among the 19th century founders of Reform Judaism in Germany and later in the United States, who thought aspiring for a Jewish state would stymie progress toward citizenship rights for Jews in other countries. In the late 19th century, there were far more anti-Zionist Orthodox Jews than there were Zionists among them. There were those who held firm to the belief that Jews should continue to secure economic, social, and citizenship rights in the countries where they lived. This anti-Zionist path was powerfully laid out by the Jewish Labor Bund, for example. As American universities' Michael Brenner and other scholars have written, Zionism ultimately won the argument because its message of Jewish restoration resonated so well at a time when nationalism was emerging as a very important way to secure justice and rights for minority peoples. Nationalism was a key motif in 19th century Europe, and Zionists placed themselves right in the middle of it. Ultimately, Zionism won out from among its detractors because of anti-Semitism and the massive trauma of the Holocaust. The Russian pogroms, anti-Jewish discrimination in the wake of World War I, discriminatory policies against Jews in the 1920s and 30s, and finally the rise of the Nazi state legitimized Zionism in the eyes of many of its one-time skeptics. And of course, any skeptics who remained were murdered in the Nazi crematoria and the killing fields of Europe. Before 1948, anti-Zionism was very different from what emerged out of the Soviet Union. For a brief time, as many of you probably know, from the end of World War II and through the early months of the Cold War, the Soviet Union and communist satellites in Eastern Europe were passionate defenders of Zionism, giving emotional speeches in support of Zionism at the fledgling United Nations. In the United States, progressive and the liberal left were also ardently in favor of Zionism. It was the foreign policy establishment that was hostile to it. Can you believe that the progressive outlet, The Nation, advocated for the creation of a Jewish state? Later, the dissemination of anti-Zionist propaganda was highly instrumental, part of the dynamics of the Cold War, and also used to quell domestic dissent. It's in this Soviet material of the late 1960s and the 1970s that we first see visuals of Israeli soldiers compared to Nazis, something that contributor Leslie Claff also discusses in her superb essay in the Journal on Holocaust Inversion. So Zionism is recast by the Soviets as a central agent of foreign capital and international imperialism. The view that Zionism is a racist ideology also emerges from this Soviet propaganda, which of course informs today's anti-Zionism on the left. Now, as my colleague suggested, this volume, it's very thin, right? It offered a critique of some of the current dominant meanings routinely given to words in the field of Israel studies. It sought to explain the language that surrounds the field of study, a vocabulary that has become unmoored from its historical meanings. And special issues in this journal, there were 18 before this one was published. They have strict word counts, they have strict deadlines, and it meant They're meant to be read by a broad audience with short essays. We couldn't include every concept. A few contributors couldn't complete their essays in time. So the project should continue with an expanded vocabulary. One term to add is Jewish supremacy. It is a descriptor today used for Israel that is frequently bandied about, including by scholars in Jewish studies. Is it accurate to deploy this term to both describe and critique the occupation and Israel's policies toward the Palestinians? In May 2021, as Jews were being beat up and harassed in Los Angeles and New York City and across Europe, over 200 Jewish and Israel studies scholars signed a statement that lamented Israel's, quote, unjust, enduring, and unsustainable systems of Jewish supremacy. The phrase Jewish supremacy evokes an ugly image. Of course, it leads one to conjure up the term white supremacy. Do Jewish studies and Israel studies scholars really need to use terms that are employed by white supremacist David Duke? Can't these scholars find another terminology to describe Palestinian oppression? Do they really need to go there? As my colleague Jared Taney recently argued, quote, academics love coining terminology, yet they drew a blank in this instance, defaulting to one of the most notorious anti-Semitic idioms ever coined. The usage here is deliberate and emotive, not analytical. It is meant to provoke outrage. And so if we ever do, Donna and Asaf, a sequel, part 2 of Word Crimes, we'll ask Jared Taney to write on Jewish supremacy. What is at stake here, and why should we care? Why should the dominant discourse be contested? The title of our volume, Word Crimes, invites readers to think seriously about the consequences and ramifications of a distorted language, how it coarsens campus discourse, how it negatively impacts the campus climate, the slanderous accusation that Israel is conducting a genocidal campaign against Palestinians violates every standard of analysis. But it also provokes and animates increased antagonism towards Jews on campus. On many US campuses and here at CUNY, as anyone has been following the Jewish press knows, anti-Israel activism has taken an insidious turn. The target is not just demonizing or delegitimizing Israel. Increasingly, the target is Zionism and Zionists, Judaism and Jews. This activism today ranges from attempts to exclude Jewish students from participating in progressive coalitions on campus, and new campaigns to discredit Hillel and seek to prevent or limit Hillel's activities on campus. On some campuses, the fitness of Jewish students to serve in leadership positions has been questioned. These days, it's typical for anti-Israel protesters to equate Zionism with white supremacy. A billboard making that charge featured at Harvard Yard during Passover this past spring. Demands to disavow support for Israel or declare support for boycott Israel forces students to choose between their Jewish Zionist identities and the political or social causes that they care about. In effect, they are being told they cannot be fully Jewish on campus. They can only be the kind of Jews that use a demonizing vocabulary about Israel and Zionism. And keep in mind, too, that there are no professional risks for faculty who passionately advocate against Israel, especially when their senior colleagues are doing so. Hundreds of academics, including typically those considered the most vulnerable faculty, not yet tenured faculty, part-time contingent faculty, they didn't think twice about signing their names to a wave of statements that harshly condemned Israel for the 2021 Gaza war. The reality is that it's Jewish faculty who today increasingly feel the need to self-censor, to hide their attachments to Israel in order to avoid professional costs. These concerns are well-founded, considering that hundreds of university programs and departments today are baking anti-Zionism into their mission statements and creating academic spaces where Jewish Zionist faculty and students feel deeply disrespected, silenced, and unwelcome, including here in some academic spaces at CUNY. What ensued after the publication of this very slim volume was an international uproar, a manufactured outrage of panicked responses, petitions, counter-petitions, furious online mobbing, a very public assault and smear campaign of me, my fellow panelists, and the contributors to the volume, and pressure on the journal's editors to have the volume retracted. The charges were absurd and baseless. One was that we were engaged in a right-wing Israeli government conspiracy to stifle dissent. That such an accusation could be leveled at British scholar John Strawson, who wrote the essay on colonialism, shows just how unhinged this all was, because Strawson has taught for a decade at Birzeit University in the West Bank, a Palestinian university, and he's committed his life to the creation of a state of Palestine, and he is being cast as right-wing and an Israeli government agent. He later wrote to us, quote, "It was as if the contents touched a sensitive nerve, disturbing a comfortable world in which Israel has been irredeemably constructed as the reactionary entrant into history." Today, after so many other nasty instances of censorship in the academy, what happened to us almost seems tame by comparison. None of us lost our jobs. We weren't in the end drummed out of the academy, but some probably hoped that would happen. At the time, the vehemence of the objections came as a shock, though, and it was really unpleasant. It became clear it was an attempt to wrest control of the Association for Israel Studies and put anti-Zionists in charge and in leadership positions. That effort failed. The journal emerged stronger with a new editorial board, as did the Association for Israel Studies, with stronger leadership, more capable of pushing back against calls for censorship, threats to academic freedom, and academic boycott. Last spring, when the Middle East Studies Association adopted a resolution to boycott Israel's academic institutions, the Association for Israel Studies issued a swift denunciation, breaking ties with MESA, with the organization. The effort to have this special issue scrubbed from the scholarly record also failed. The issue sold like hotcakes, which was its own sweet revenge. It went into an unprecedented second printing, a huge surge of downloads from Indiana University Press website, which publishes the journal. The brouhaha generated so much interest in word crimes than would have otherwise ever been the case. We heard from an academic in Japan who was teaching about modern-day Israel, had read about the controversy on the pages of the Chronicle of Higher Education. Pages of a Chronicle of Higher, you can't get into the pages of Chronicle of Higher Education, right? It was like, wow. So we were in there, he read about it, and he asked, how can I order 24 copies of this for my class? So this unprecedented public repudiation, I think, raises important questions for the field which continue to reverberate. Let me conclude. At the end of his essay, Shani Moore notes, quote, "There is a difference between making a criticism, however sweeping, however harsh, of a state or a government or a policy or even a society at large, and making the claim that a political community as such should not normatively exist at all. The propaganda assault of the last 50 years on Israel and Zionism has had a profound impact on the academy. An ideological cluster of words, terms, concepts deployed to deny another people's right to exist and to justify the rejection and boycott of any and all exchange with them, cultural, scientific, academic, athletic, touristic, is unlike any other international conflict. In this dominant discourse, Israel, Israeli Jews, and many of you, their supporters in the diaspora, are illegitimate, an illegitimate party to the conflict with the Palestinians. Only the Palestinians have legitimate rights in this discourse. I'll close with John Strawson's personal reflections as a contributor to the Word Crime Special Issue. Scholars of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict have a special obligation to work in such a way that we can help clarify the issues that confront the parties. Never before have we needed civility in academic debate more. We need greater rigor, more serious critique, deeper nuance and subtlety. We need to leave knee-jerk tweeting to politicians and renew collegiate exchanges. We scholars need to take stock. We must all renegotiate the relationship between political commitment and the academy. Word crimes can become that line in the sand if we want it to be. Thank you.
Thank you all for 3 wonderful and very informative talks. I apologize for the late hour. We have extended past where we had anticipated, and I think to compensate, we will extend it a bit after. But if people need to leave, we won't take it personally. Have the cards? Please pass out the cards. While we're going to start with a slightly abbreviated, moderated question and answer, and then we'll move to questions there from the audience. So. Let me start, if I may, by trying to give voice to some of the questions my anti-Zionist colleagues might pose. If they were here, or if they had remained, I think they would ask something like the following. We can redefine these terms however you want, but that's just a semantic debate. Shouldn't the fact that Israel is persecuting Palestinians on the ground trump discourse? Or as the mass email that they sent this afternoon put it, quote, "This is not a conflict. This is settler colonialism and apartheid. The use of any other language is designated to obfuscate and politically confuse people so that they do not support the internationally recognized Palestinian right to resist colonialism and apartheid. Hashtag Zionism out of CUNY," unquote. By the way, I wrote that question before the mass email was sent, so I think I deserve credit for accurately representing their position. So let me open it up to the 3 of you.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, let me take the most recent example of persecution on the ground. I mean, I do believe that one has to view actions to see if they correspond to the words being used. So in 1993, Israel signed the Oslo Accords with the representatives of the Palestine Liberation Organization. And the thrust of the Oslo Accords was to have a kind of step-by-step process for negotiating all aspects of the conflict and developing the infrastructure for a Palestinian state. And again, negotiate territory, negotiate issues of refugees, negotiate all sorts of things. By first off, in the aftermath of Oslo, it was more insecure for Israel. There were more casualties in Israel, as well as some pretty egregious attacks, the Baruch Goldstein attack in Hebron. But it almost seemed, with the announcement of the Oslo Accords, that there were some people who wanted to refight 1948 on the ground. But still, there was progress. So by the year 2000, the Palestinian Authority, which governed at that point Gaza and the West Bank, was in charge, had a civil administration, was beginning to develop the idea of an air force, had their own stamps, were beginning to have the symbols and all sorts of aspects of sovereignty. And at the 2000 Camp David negotiations between Ehud Barak, and I should say that Israel in 1999 elected a government that wanted to resolve the issues, that wanted to end the conflict. And Ehud Barak, who always thought he was the smartest person in the room, which may not have proved accurate, but whatever, he thought that what needed to be done was not to do a step-by-step approach that had been the Oslo approach up until then, but to do it all. So he came to Camp David with all kinds of plans. The response was not to say, well, I don't like your map, I want to add the map here, or we have to divide Jerusalem in a different way, or stuff. The response of the Palestinians was the Second Intifada. And the Second Intifada killed more Israelis than some of the other, or was the second largest killer of Israelis from the time of the 48 war. There were bombings of teenage places to hang out, of pizza, and the Israelis, while there was then a one-time election for just the prime minister, and they elected Ariel Sharon as prime minister as their only secret weapon. The thinking in 2001, when he was elected, the initial thinking was the Israelis can't do much about this because they don't have international support, and there would be lots of army casualties if they go back to reoccupy the West Bank, and there would be lots of civilian casualties. So what they did in 2001, what the army did, was to think of new tactics, new strategies, to practice little by little in some of the Palestinian areas, not to do a wholesale invasion because they felt intimidated that they didn't have the right possibilities. And it was awful living, if some of us were there, it was awful living in Israel. You heard one siren and you thought, well, maybe that's a heart attack. You heard two sirens and you thought, maybe that's a fire. But you began to hear sirens and you knew you had to ask if people were okay. In January of 2002, the Israeli Navy saw and captured an Iranian, the Karin, an Iranian ship attempting to send weapons, to deliver weapons to the Palestinians. Then March 27th, the first night of Hanukkah, there was a suicide bombing that killed 30 people in a hotel in Netanya. And that led, by that time, the army knew how to take on Jenin, take on the refugee camps. And let me tell you just one little story about Israeli democracy. Right as soon as the attack, the Israeli attack on Jenin began, some human rights groups went to the Supreme Court and said that there's a massacre being committed by the Israeli soldiers in Jenin. They're killing families, they're wiping out whole parts of the city, and the president of the Supreme Court called the chief of staff and said, you have to stop that attack until we can investigate. It turned out not to be a massacre. It turned out to be an ordinary conflict, but that's the kind of power the Supreme Court had of review, and that's what Israel is dealing with. So the possibility of moving towards a state was obviously eroded for the Palestinians. They had to have checkpoints. There were all kinds of things. Israel, it is in Israel's interest to share the land, however we're going to draw the map. It is in Israel's interest to find Palestinians who want a state. They haven't been able to do that yet.
Thank you. Do you have quick,
I
because
have
we're not going to give
a
a look.
very quick,
Okay.
and it's the hashtag Zionist out of CUNY that you raised, that was in the email, in the online campaign today, and I think it's just important to realize how that might be really helpful off campus as a campaign. But on campus, that is not what we do. On campus, we have open inquiry, right? We have intellectual freedom. And the anti-normalization that's built into the anti-Israel movement, or the boycott, divestment, sanctions, BDS movement, where even talking with Zionists, whether it's student peers or faculty, or at UC Berkeley, there's now 14 student groups who have said, we will not bring in any Zionist speaker, no Zionist speakers on any topic, right? So this is antithetical to everything the university stands for. This is not what we're supposed to do on campuses. And it's a tactic, the academic boycott, it's antithetical to the university's goals and missions and values. And so I just wanted to stress that. And I think that, we need to assign material based on the narrative of BDS, because it is in the peer-reviewed literature. And when I teach, and I've taught for 25 years, I assign material from Journal of Palestine Studies, because it's a peer-reviewed material, and this is something that all students need to be exposed to, even though it's difficult, it's tough, it may go against the grain, it may go against what you heard before coming to college, but it's simply bad pedagogy for a faculty member to say, I am only going to assign the BDS narrative because this is not a conflict. Okay, that might be one perspective, assign one article on it, but then don't shortchange students by not allowing them to see that there's a huge and rich literature. What Donna was just describing is 7 different journal articles, okay, that need to be in the syllabus as well. And so that's my beef with BDS. It's that it is harmful and threatening to the academic principles that we cherish in the university system. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to, do you mind if I?
Go ahead.
I want to move to another. So I'm going to use that as a segue to another question that I had, which is, and particularly for you, Miriam. At one of the talks put on by the Cross-CUNY Working Group Against Racism and Colonialism I mentioned in my introductory remarks, one of the invited speakers stated, quote, "The Zionist colonial project is white supremacist, inherently racist, and aimed at the extermination of the Palestinian population, and this has been clearly stated by the founder of Zionism, Theodor Herzl," unquote. Were she here today and willing to dialogue with us, I could imagine her asking something like the following. Miriam, in your talk, you define Zionism as a, quote, movement for Jewish self-determination, unquote. But I've watched interviews online with right-wing Israeli settlers who, to my eyes, seem to partake of a definition of Zionism that is much closer to mine, and for whom the application of the term Jewish supremacist, which is actually one of the questions that somebody asked for us to talk more about, one of the terms you critique seems rather apt. Why do you get to define these terms rather than these settlers and me?
Wow, can you believe it? There's a democracy, and there's some bigots and racists in the democracy, and they actually get elected. Where do we? So, one thing is to differentiate between an identity, a national project, and specific individuals. So it is disheartening, in my view, that 10 or 11% of Israelis in the last election voted for the far right. I think we should not sugarcoat that. I think it is a problem, and it's particularly could be a problem for the Supreme Court and its status in Israel. I am repulsed that somebody could be a minister in the Israeli government who hung a portrait of Baruch Goldstein on his living room wall. But that doesn't justify moving from that and criticizing that politician or that political party or that government to, delegitimizing and denying a country's right to exist. I mean, that's two very separate moves there. And I would just say first of all, I would have a dialogue with your colleague, that 10 or 11% of Israelis voted for the far right, but in France, 40% vote for the far right. So there's something going on in our democracies where populism is becoming more popular, where the right is having a rejuvenation, and we need to explain that, and Israel's part of that, is part of the whole set of democracies that are facing these kinds of challenges. So again, it's about normalizing Israel. Israel's in some sui generis, unique, it faces all the same problems as other democratic states. So that's, and the last thing in terms of settlers, I would say to your colleague that the settlers are not a monolithic group. And you need to really study this. You need to go and do field work and do interviews and surveys and talk with people who live beyond the Green Line. Why do they live there? I did some of that work, and I found that in my interviews, it was more out of fear than hate. What do they fear? Many of those I talked to, and I talked to people in Tapuach and various, sort of, the far right settlements. They're really afraid that if they leave, holy sites will be desecrated. I heard that again and again and again in my field work that I did in the early 90s and sort of mid-90s. They also said they were willing to live as citizens of a sovereign state of Palestine, provided they would not be asked to leave the areas where they live, right near holy sites. And so that's a very different view of a particular settler community, right? And that's different than the Hilltop youth, the hooligans, who I feel the state has abdicated their responsibility for young people. A lot of them are yeshiva kids who couldn't make it in yeshiva, and now they're trying to do something meaningful in their life. And it's another group, right? So I would also encourage your colleague to look at all the positives that are happening in the West Bank between Jews and Arabs every day, every single day, coming together around economics, social, education. Those are stories that are being left out of the narrative, and we need to, as educators, showcase that for our students.
Thank you.
Can I say one thing about the reference to Theodore Herzl?
Please go ahead.
I find it hysterical. Theodore Herzl died in 1904, sadly, at the age of 44, I think. Yeah. And he was opposed to what then was the settlement movement. He thought you had to have an international charter first to do all these things. His death allowed more agricultural, more resources devoted to them, but quoting him for something
misquoting. I don't think he said, no, it wasn't, I quoted her saying that.
That's a misquote, yeah.
I mean, just to be clear, if I can, as the moderator, interject for a moment, right? In Der Altneuland, he imagines, incorrectly, but he imagines the local population as receiving them with open arms and being thrilled for this. So he doesn't, not being pushed out at all.
But he was, he was a 19th century liberal.
Look, it's an attempt to put America's problems with race onto the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's a politicized move. It's weaponizing language. That's what it is, and it's unhelpful. It's not what we do in the academy.
Let me just say one thing. I think the weaponization of the terms is the critical part of what the BDS movement has done at large. But, to understand the dynamic in Israel and the politics at large, rejectionism has constantly trumped statehood. I mean, what you're seeing, I mean, full disclosure, I mean, I was part of the Oslo Accords. I mean, I was also part of the negotiations that led to the peace process with Jordan. Everything we did, you know, at 4 o'clock in the morning, Arafat squashed because he didn't want to move along these conversations. The amount that we agreed upon when it came to education, irrigation issues, the question about, you know, one of the questions we asked about democratization, which was a fascinating question back in the 90s, was what kind of form of democratization would you want? And the Palestinians answered, we want the Israeli democracy because we can see anti-Israel voices heard in the Israeli democracy. I mean, you know, that's what they saw as a model. Moreover, it was fascinating to observe that, you know, on the question of the settlers, you know, and again, they have to be broken down because based on the Arab-Palestinian narrative, so are those living in the Golan Heights are also settlers. I mean, you got secular, you got, you know, religious, you got different kinds of pockets. The argument was, would you be willing to accept dual citizenship in the Palestinian state to be? And the answer was flatly no. This has to be Judenrein. And so, again, the question of collaboration and the question of participation of Arab Israelis in the Israeli Knesset, not to mention in the last wave of elections, you had an Islamist party in the Israeli Knesset. I mean, so this, you know, it has to be contextualized as far as the kind of democracy Israel's at. It's not American-style democracy, and I agree 100%. This is an attempt to project a debate about race in America today to the Arab-Israeli conflict, which has nothing to do with the reality on the ground.
Thank you. Let me blend now in with some questions from the audience. Then there are some really outstanding ones here, so and there's just so many, so I apologize, I won't be able to get to all of them. But, and I'm going to combine this with one of my own, because what's the term? Great minds think alike, right? So is the term colonization an acceptable description of Israeli settlement construction in the occupied territories? And I'll add to it from my own question, which I asked, which is, right, Donna, in your paper, you argue that settler colonialism is not appropriate for Israeli settlement of Palestine, but didn't Zionists themselves use the language of colonization, right, to describe their endeavors in the early 20th century? So did they not settle the land? Did they not, by definition, settle the land through colonialism? And why is this term, therefore, why, in your mind, misleading? Misleading.
When they started to settle the land, they used the word colony in the way it was originally used in the Roman Empire. That is, as a tenant farmer, and they weren't settler colonialism. The narrative presumes that the settlers are underwritten by a government, so that the first fleet that arrived in 1788 in Sydney, Australia, was a fleet that was paid for by the British government looking for another penal colony. And the kinds of colonial enterprises in America came, to some extent, the Trail of Tears. It came from the American government. When the members of the first Aliyah in the 1880s and 1890s came to Ottoman Palestine, they were supported, or supported is probably an exaggeration, they came on behalf of a Romanian immigration society, or the Odessa Committee. It was not a state-run enterprise, and they tried to have, as much as they could, positive relations with the Arabs in Palestine. Many, even in the second Aliyah, Yitzhak ben Tzvi learns Arabic. They romanticize this. So it is, look, even Benjamin Netanyahu, who's a graduate of the Sloan School at MIT, can count. And if you can count, you know there's no stability, no long-term future to having a so-called single state. Keeping all the land means keeping all the people. It's not useful. It's unsustainable, totally unsustainable.
Is there anything else that either of you would want to add, or? Okay. Let's see. Sorry. let me jump to a question I was going to ask near the end, but just in case as people are leaving. But we still have more. In your opinion, why should people care that the discourse on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been co-opted? Is this only a parochial issue, or is it part of a larger problem? What do you think that problem is?
It's a problem for the academy. You should know history when you should be able to talk about anything. I mean, I taught at Smith for 40 or so years, and I would come into the course I taught on the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and say, let's talk first about our biases or whatever they are. Said, I'll admit I'm a card-carrying member of a Zionist organization because when I got married, my mother-in-law made me a life member of Hadassah, and I didn't think it was a good idea to start a marriage by rejecting that. But I said that what you need to do is to understand what Zionism is. You need to understand Palestinian history. I don't care if people are pro or anti-Zionist. I want them, you have to teach students how to think, not what to think. And when you've lost that in the academy, whether it's the Middle East or it's about race or American history, it's terrible. We're facing serious problems, and if you can't talk about them and you can't learn about them, we're not going to get out of them.
This is the degradation of the academy at large. I mean, there is, the anti-normalization, to Miriam's point, it's made a black and white binary issue. I mean, the fact of the matter is that, when you're talking to students today, they don't know. If you want to learn about this region, which is a wealth of knowledge when it comes to culture, politics, language, you got to go. If you're going to boycott the one place that has the information and not have discourse, that is antithetical to the academy at large. The Western liberal academy is supposed to be about discourse. It's about inquiry. It's about thinking. Otherwise, what makes a difference in a university in Tehran? I mean, this is what the goal should be about learning about this rich area. And if you're only teaching one side of the conflict, you're doing a disservice. And the fact that there is an inability today to have, if you don't like an opinion you hear, that the immediate response is to cancel that is concerning. That is concerning about what the academy is about. And if the academy is about producing people who are going to think and not to produce words that are going to hijack the conflict and prevent debate, then you're doing an entire disservice and want to question what is happening in our institutions.
And let me just add to these points. I agree with everything my colleagues have said, that it might be interesting to think of why there isn't any BDS in STEM fields and why it's in the humanities or in some of the softer social sciences. What explains that? And I think what explains it is that for 25 years, certain disciplines in the humanities have shifted their objective. The mission of those disciplines has become the emancipation of oppressed peoples and social justice, rather than objective knowledge production, rather than the testing of competing causal claims, and the search for truth. And I mean, and that's really a problem for the university as a whole. I've said it's really not the Jews' problem. It's really not just the problem of Israel studies. Or it's a larger issue, and these sort of orthodoxies on other topics are happening too. So, we're sort of the canary in the coal mine, but it's happening elsewhere too. And I think it's time to almost take back the university for its traditional missions.
One more point. I mean, the fact that, the Middle East Studies Association of America decided to vote on BDS and to ignore everything that's happening in the region and to, contrast that with the Abraham Accords, which has literally made no iota on the Middle East, which is one of the first set of normalized relations with the Arab world since 1994, is quite telling about how disengaged and how disconnected the academy is from the reality on the ground. I mean, that should be quite telling about, it's not entirely about the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic. And by the way, my colleague and friend, the ambassador to the United States from Bahrain and from the UAE, Yosef Utaiba, have all commented to the Palestinians in saying, this is the modality you should adopt about normalization as far as cultural exchange, as far as economics, as far as things. I mean, so again, changing those narratives, and they are saying openly, we as Arabs believe in your right, but let's look at what's going on the ground. I mean, that is a total disconnect. Those are the kind of things that need to be opened and looked at very carefully.
Thank you. I'm going to ask another question from the audience, and I'm going to combine it with one of my own. So the question from the audience is, I have trouble identifying what information is actually fact due to completely opposite framing on each side. And I'll combine that with my own question, which is, in the subsequent volume of Israel studies, right? Some of the members of the editorial board wrote that that your volume is, quote, is highly polemical and deviates sharply from academic standards and acceptable scholarly norms. Its publication clearly crossed the lines between academic scholarship and political advocacy, unquote. Right? And these are the very same charges that you are making against them. So kind of picking up on this question from the audience, how do we assess who's right here when, which side is right?
I think it's fair to raise that question, read the articles, do your own reading in the background, and draw a conclusion. I was when this was published, I happened to be president of the Association for Israel Studies. And when people started yelling and screaming about this, I mean, I was totally shocked. I've published many things for many years, and no one's paid any attention. I said, did you read, did you read the introduction? Did you read that? Well, we don't have to. So I think it's fair to draw your own conclusions and read what's in here and see whether those charges have any validity.
That's the dishonesty. I mean, Donna is being a little bit, very modest, as always, and humble. But, the attacks on Donna personally, as a result of being in her role, were unheard of. I mean, but nobody read anything, which is part of the dishonesty about all of this. Nobody reads anything. If you actually want to take the article on its merits, which is what we were actually offering people to do, and have discourses, symposiums, conversations, let's debate the issue. People refused because of the rise of cancel culture. They saw terms that they believed they had an immediate answer for and refused to talk about it, and they already characterized us as in this demonic auspices without actually reading what we did or what we wrote about. That's dishonest, and that is disingenuous to what the Academy should be about.
And I'll just add that if you do want to read it, it is available at Indiana University Press. You can still download, actually for free, the intro and our conclusion. And in the intro, we talk about an interesting case of a historian in Israel, Eliezer Taubor, who wrote a new book about Deir Yassin, which is an iconic kind of case in the Palestinian narrative. And he did just forensic as a historian, went into looked at all the documents, as a historian would do, and he found, there was no massacre there, but there was an attempt to call it a massacre for political reasons. I mean, and it's a great book, and guess what? When it came to university presses in the States and went to reviewers, they said it is a great book, and because it's such a great book, it should never be published, because it challenges the narrative, and that's not good. And he could not get a university press because there was this gatekeeping that was happening, and that's what we experienced. We experienced the equivalent of what happened to Eliezer Taubor, where we were basically being told this should not even be out there because it's too challenging for the hegemonic orthodoxy. It's too challenging. It's too provocative. And the journal editor said, we'll let you write another one. You can write your own Israel studies with your perspective, and then we can assign both of them in courses. But they refused. And so I think it goes back to your earlier question about, what this really means for the academy as a whole.
And for the record, we got it published, Tauber's book.
Tauber's book did eventually get published.
I got it
Yes.
published.
Thank you. So on that note of hearing all sides, a question from the audience. In a conversation on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, why are there no Palestinian scholars or scholars of Palestinian politics? And that actually, by the way, is a criticism of CAFI, which I'm an executive member of too, so I have to take blame for this. But the question is up here, right now. No, I think up here today. I think in this, the intention was, I'm reading this as, this is right. We are calling this a conversation in this talk today. Why did we not invite
the three editors of Word Crimes were us, so that's why we're up here. I mean, we are the three co-editors of this 2019 symposium, which then we are kind of revisiting as this panel. However, I will say that I published a book on Jerusalem. Some of my work is on the city of Jerusalem and contested city, and I tried desperately to get Palestinians to write pieces for that book. It came out in 2013, 2014 with Syracuse University Press, and none would be willing to write alongside Israeli scholars. So the boycott is so entrenched that it's very difficult to create those kinds. I mean, when you have people who say, I will not dialogue with Zionists, I will not even, I will not sit with them because they are inherently illegitimate, it's very hard to do that kind of programming, unfortunately.
I mean, you have like examples. I mean, look, one of the more toxic terms relates to, apropos, talking about, learning about the other, has to do with the Holocaust. The only Holocaust based on the Arab-Palestinian narrative is the Nakba. And one of the few individuals, scholars, who were willing to actually take Palestinian teachers to Auschwitz was Mohammad Dajani, my colleague and friend Dajani. And when Dajani came back, he was fired, because he dared to break the orthodoxy. I mean, Dajani represents one of the, third wave individuals. He will talk about what's going on, in kind of the silent majority, in Palestinian society, that, voices that are not commonly heard. But he's in the minority, and you're going to have a hard time finding individuals who are willing to actually talk about this openly. And he was boycotted, and so, he was out of there, because that's, you don't do that.
Yeah, it's gotten worse. I was sort of friendly with Sari Nusseibeh and had him come. He came to Smith. He was very good. He was in a program with Moshe Maoz. I have had Arabs, Palestinians, come, but once Sari Nusseibeh got to be president of El Quds, it was very difficult for him to do that without risking his life. And, there were all kinds of changes. So you can, you can get some Palestinians to interact on a certain level, but not it's not easy. I've interviewed, I did a book on women, and I focused on Palestinian women. And in the 70s and 80s, I was able to interview Palestinian women back and forth, but I had to mention a name, as if I knew someone who could get me entry. And thankfully, Smith, before I got there, had employed one of the Husseinis. So I used his name a lot to get invited to people's houses.
Thank you. I also should just add to take responsibility that the title that you offered was Word Crime, was the title of the volume, and CAFI changed it to a conversation on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So it's Kathy's fault for having
I thought
created
we
that
weren't-
title and
yeah,
then not invited a
We're not
Palestinian.
ashamed of the title. I mean, we knew, you know.
No, not to be rude, but it's our
yeah.
responsibility, because
Yeah.
there's a valid point. We created a title and then did not offer, do not have
like
a
an
Palestinian.
explanation for it. Yeah.
We kind of covered this before, but maybe not quite in as much detail. So Miriam kind of answered this. But Donna, does the recent Israeli election belie some of the arguments made in the articles in the Journal a few years ago? That is, does the new hard-right alliance give a new legitimacy to some of the claims that Israel is a fascist apartheid state, for example?
Well, we have to wait. Netanyahu, the prime minister designate, has just asked for an extension to form the government. So while, like Miriam, I'm disturbed by some of the people Netanyahu has legitimized and enabled. Again, he can count. There's a relatively high threshold, 3.25% of the votes cast, which is about 4 seats in the Knesset, to be able to qualify to be in the Knesset. And so he took it upon himself, says a lot about Netanyahu, but at any rate, he was able to force a unity on this hard right that no one, center, left, Arab, matched, and in fact were very disunited and didn't have a ground game to get out the vote. So it was the center and left that helped Netanyahu and helped this government get the kind of seats and potential coalition. We're yet to see if it can govern and what's going to happen.
And I would just say that the last government, which had an Arab party from the Muslim Brotherhood in the governing coalition for the first time, and was the most diverse government in Israel's history, and had women, and in every respect, it was a very diverse government compared to what appears to be in the hopper coming out now. But despite that, one of the worst anti-Israel campaigns was concocted and rolled out, the Boston Mapping Project, exactly at the time when Israel had this great government, right? And nobody, it was, wow, diverse, and an Arab party in the first time. And for haters, it does not matter who's in power, who's the prime minister, who isn't the prime minister, what's the political party. And by the way, the haters also aren't going to go investigate. Why is it that so many Arab citizens of mixed cities of Israel voted for Itamar Ben-Gvir, and he got votes? Why is that? Explain it. Go study it. Figure out, why did this character, right, who has the Baruch Goldstein, and in a sense, it's despite of that they voted for him, because he was Mr. Security. And you have to explain that. You have to go and understand why voters discounted the racism and the other stuff and voted for it. And that's a story for other democracies too, including our own, right? But they don't want to do the work or the research. It's easier to just use the slogans.
And by the way, every Israeli leader, left, right, or center, has been depicted in SS uniforms. I mean, the Holocaust inversion in the conflict, the hatred had nothing to do with the actual parties in Israel. I mean, that has been consistent and ties into, my point before about the fact that rejectionism trumps statehood. I mean, and the policy is, let's try to parachute something that we know is not going to happen by not actually having a conversation. And that's the tactic of UDI, Unilateral Declaration of Independence, that has been coming out of institutions like the United Nations here in New York, which again, means nothing.
Thank you. I want to thank our 3 panelists for a 3 wonderful talks.
Well, thank you. You're doing such a good job.
Thank you. I hope we did what.
Great.